Every single year, Muslims lament and weep for the tragedy of Ashura, where the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad was brutally massacred along with his family and companions in the land of Karbala. Refusing to bow down to a tyrant, he stood firm until the day of Ashura, where he lost his most loyal followers, his closest friends, and his own children, including his 6-month-old infant child. As we remember the tragedy of Karbala, one wonders how the intricacies of this story that we hear every year reached us. How do we know exactly what happened on Ashura? How do we know the names of those who fought and died alongside Imam Husayn? How do we know of the dialogue that happened in Karbala, both during the battle and the night prior among the tents of Imam Husayn? And how did all this information reach us? In this documentary, we shall be exploring the history of the maqtal, that is the narration of the killing of Imam Husayn, and how it reached our pulpits today, over 1,000 years later.
الجواد مخزية والسارج عليه ملوية خرجنا من الخدور على الخدود لاطمات وبالعويل داعيات وبعد العز مذللات وإلى مصرع الحسين مبادرات.
I remember when I was a child, maybe 5 or 6 years old, and the maqtal of Imam Husayn would just reverberate in my mind. When the day of Ashura would come and I would hear that maqtal, I felt as if the maqtal occurred on some other planet. I could not fathom that these events happened here on planet Earth. In my young, childish mind, I thought this must have happened in some other planet. How could this happen? It just was surreal for me. The Umayyads went to great lengths to avoid informing people of who was killed in Karbala. When they celebrated in Damascus and Sham in those early days, they would not tell people who was killed. They would say there's a family, rebels, and basically God gave us victory over them. But then news started to spread. They tried to deflect the blame. One way to do so was to blame Ibn Ziyad. It's the governor of Kufa who was responsible for that, not us. Another narrative was that Imam Husayn alayhi salam, he is the one who sparked violence. He knew there was a legitimate leader ruling in Damascus. Why did he go to Iraq? But it was very difficult for them to justify it.
Because they warped and twisted the divine will of what Allah and His Messenger had determined of what Khilafat is, they transposed it in such a way to indicate that the Khalifa is the absolute ruler. Regardless of whether that's Muawiyah, whether that's Abdul Malik, whoever it is, the Khalifa is the absolute ruler. So anyone that rises up against the Khalifa, whether that be someone like Abu Abdullah alayhi salam, is essentially a rebel. There are people that believed that Imam Husayn was a rebel, that he was rebelling against the legitimate, so-called, alleged legitimate state authority of the time.
Unfortunately, they use some verses of the Quran to prove their point. They say Allah said in the Quran, تُؤْتِي الْمُلْكَ مَنْ تَشَاءُ وَتُعِزُّ مَنْ تَشَاءُ وَتُذِلُّ مَنْ تَشَاءُ. You give the kingdom to whomever you want. You take the kingdom away from whomever you want. So in this case, he was chosen by Allah to be the king. They also make a narration saying that whatever happened in this universe is done by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They believe that human being is free from any responsibility.
Most people in the Muslim Ummah did not accept their narrative. They knew that this narrative was biased and it was not justified in any way. That is why so many revolutions took place after the martyrdom of Imam Husayn alayhi salam. People could not accept the narrative. It was just unjustified.
One of the most important compilers of the maqtal of Imam Husayn was a man named Lut ibn Yahya, also known as Abu Mikhnaf. His name is often heard in the various maqatil that we read today. Who was this man, and how did he contribute to the maqtal of Imam Husayn?
Abu Mikhnaf is regarded as one of the first historians to document what happened in Karbala. Abu Mikhnaf was born in the second half of the first Hijri century. He came from a noble family in Kufa. He was known to be the greatest historian in Kufa during his era. Now there is a discussion amongst historians as to whether he was Shia or not. It is very clear from his works that he truly loved the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. You may call him a Shi'i in the general sense of the term, that you love the Ahlul Bayt, peace be upon them, deeply. But most scholars would dispute that he was an Imami, a Shi'i who saw the Imams as being appointed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Abu Mikhnaf takes it upon himself to compile the maqtal, the eulogy and the killing of Imam Husayn alayhi salam. He begins to search for eyewitnesses who were there present in Karbala. And he wrote a very important book called the Maqtal of Imam Husayn alayhi salam. Now, unfortunately, his book has not survived throughout history. And in fact, his 30 other books, none of them have survived history. What we know about his works is from other historians. For instance, Tabari, the famous Sunni historian, he has narrated nearly 100 narrations from Abu Mikhnaf. So you can find his narrations in the works of other historians.
What's unique about Lut ibn Yahya or Abu Mikhnaf is that what we know about him is that he was a historian. There have been many people who have sought to write about aspects or narratives of history in different periods. Not all of them had a sense of detail and nuance and methodology in the same way that Lut ibn Yahya did. When someone says that Abu Mikhnaf said this, Lut ibn Yahya said this, all of a sudden it comes with that sense of validation that this man, he understood, he knew what he was talking about.
You find that he narrates from 39 reporters. Some of these individuals he directly met, and they were eyewitnesses in Karbala. For instance, one of them is Uqba ibn Sam'an. He was the servant of Lady Rabab. Another figure that we find he spoke to directly was the wife of Zuhair ibn al-Qayn. Her name was Dalham or Dulham, the daughter of Amr. She narrates a few incidents about Karbala. She encouraged her husband, Zuhair ibn al-Qayn, on his way back to Iraq from Hajj to meet Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam. He meets Abu Abdullah al-Husayn. And you know the nur of Abu Abdullah al-Husayn. When you see that light, it transforms you if you have goodness in you. He came back, he brought down the tents, he asked his wife, go to your family. I've decided to join Imam Husayn alayhi salam. And it's going to be a treacherous journey. I don't want you to be here. She narrates another incident that Abu Mikhnaf has captured for us. After the battle was over, the Imam was killed, the Shuhada were also killed. She sent one of the servants of her husband in order to put him in the kafan, to enshroud him and to bury him. So he goes to Karbala, he tries to identify the body of his master Zuhair ibn al-Qayn, and he wants to put him in the shroud, in the kafan. He realizes that the body of Imam Husayn alayhi salam has no kafan. So he says, how can I put my master in kafan, enshroud him, when Abu Abdullah al-Husayn has no kafan?
ونادت زينب وأخاه وسيده وأهل بيته ليت السماء أطبقت على الأرض وليت الجبال تدكدكت على السهل وانتهت نحو الحسين وقد دنا منه عمر بن سعد في جماعة من أصحابه والحسين يجود بنفسه فصاحت أي عمر أيقتل أبو عبد الله وأنت تنظر إليه فصرف بوجهه.
It wasn't until I was maybe 12 or 13 years old when I ended up reading what happened to Imam Husayn alayhi salam on my own. I remember sitting in my room, being so overwhelmed with emotion, crying like I never ever cried before. And every year, when I reread my notes in order to prepare majalis for the days of Ashura and to remember and recollect the tragedy of Imam Husayn alayhi salam, I always have certain moments where I just stop and I can't continue. Listening to the tragedy of the Imam alayhi salam in his final moments is something that I only reserve for the day of Ashura. I can never listen to it in such detail because of how heart-wrenching it is. Likely the first maqtal of Imam Husayn alayhi salam that was written was the maqtal of a companion of Imam Ali alayhi salam, a man by the name of al-Asbagh bin Nubata, who is famously recollected within the pulpit with his intense love for Imam Ali alayhi salam. He lives during the lifetime of Imam Ali, of Imam al-Hasan, of Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam, meaning he outlived the tragedy of Karbala, and it wasn't a decade that passed, and we know that he had written a maqtal of Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam. Unfortunately, due to the political situation, due to a whole host of reasons that probably we could only speculate upon, that work of his was unfortunately lost and we don't have it with us today. Secondly, we have the maqtal written by a man by the name of Jabir bin Yazid al-Ja'fi, who was a companion of Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam and someone who was a close confidant of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam. He was known as Sahib al-Sir, someone who would be exposed to the secrets of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam. Unfortunately as well, the work of Jabir al-Ja'fi was also lost. A third maqtal is a maqtal written by a man by the name of Ammar bin Muawiyah al-Dahani. And unfortunately, though he was also a companion of Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, we have also lost that one. We have other works, for instance, the maqtal of Shaykh al-Saduq, who is one of our greatest and most important and significant scholars, but only a portion of that has reached us. Why we are so often focusing on the work of Abu Mikhnaf is that so many of our early scholars, including al-Saduq, including the famous historian at-Tabari, they would consistently quote Abu Mikhnaf, recognizing again that it was the central authority in that which took place and transpired in the tragedy of Karbala to Imam Husayn alayhi salam.
We have two types of maqtals, the primary maqtals and the secondary ones. The primary maqtals are like the maqtal of Abu Mikhnaf. He compiled the maqtal, he gathered the information and the sources. Secondary maqatil are those maqtals who report from the primary sources. So when we say we have about 30 maqtals, we're not talking about primary maqtals. We have very few primary maqtals. We're talking about the secondary ones. Those who came after, they still had access to the primary maqtals before they basically became extinct and they were no longer in circulation. They had access to them and they would narrate from them. My analysis is that during those times, you had governments who were very hostile to the mission of Imam Husayn. Even the Abbasids, who initially came under the slogan of Al-Muhammad, the Abbasids rose to power claiming that they wanted to seek revenge for what happened to Imam Husayn. But this was just a political mechanism to assume power. Once they assumed power, they fought the visitors of Imam Husayn. We're all familiar with the role of al-Mutawakkil al-Abbasi in trying to destroy the grave of Imam Husayn, in killing and persecuting everyone who would come to Karbala. So those governments would naturally try to bury any book about the maqtal of Imam Husayn alayhi salam. My understanding is that in those years of persecution, it was difficult to circulate the maqatil. If you were found to be distributing a maqtal, scribing it, copying it, you would be in trouble with the government. Visiting the Imam alayhi salam was seen as a threat to these governments. Imagine if you're circulating a whole maqtal about what happened to Imam Husayn, because when people would read that, they would explode with emotional power and they would rise against the evil rulers of their time. So it seems that this political repression stopped these primary sources from being circulated. And over time, they basically were lost and we don't have any trace of them, unfortunately. The good news is we have secondary sources that copied parts of these primary sources. So a lot of their content has been preserved.
When we talk about those who narrated the tragedy of Karbala, we talk about four different groups of people. The first group are those who were with Imam Husayn alayhi salam, from amongst his companions and amongst his family members, but those who outlived the Imam salamullah alayhi, meaning that they were not killed on the day of Ashura. The most famous example is a man by the name of Uqba ibn Sam'an. Uqba ibn Sam'an was the slave of Rabab, the wife of Imam al-Husayn salamullah alayhi. And he narrates himself that I was with Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam every step of the journey from the day that we left Medina until the 10th of Muharram. Meaning that he was with the Imam salamullah alayhi, and he was amongst those individuals who was exposed to the nuance and the detail of all of these conversations that took place leading up to the day of Ashura and through the day of Ashura. A second personality, as an example of those who outlived the Imam alayhi salam, is a man by the name of al-Dhahak ibn Abdullah al-Mashriqi, a man who pledged his allegiance to Imam al-Husayn alayhi salatu wassalam, and at the last moment on the day of Ashura, he tells the Imam alayhi salam to give him permission to rescind the pledge of allegiance that he had given him and allow for him to return back to his family because of the fear that he was imposed by the army of Umar ibn Sa'd. But he was one of those who narrate the conversations that Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam engaged in on the night of Ashura. The second group of individuals who narrated the tragedy of Karbala are the women and the children. For instance, we have the wife of Zuhair ibn al-Qayn, Dulham, who narrates certain events of that which took place and transpired leading up to the day of Ashura, and even that which took place after the day of Ashura. In addition to that, of course, we have those who were present from the infallible sources, like that of Imam Zayn al-Abidin, like that of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir alayhi salam, who were present on the day of Ashura, and they were also able to narrate at least portions or minor details about that which took place, along with many women, including Lady Zaynab. In addition, there's a man by the name of Hassan al-Muthanna, the son of Imam al-Hassan, salamullah alayhi, the brother of Qasim. Hassan al-Muthanna was injured and wounded on the day of Ashura, and on the night of the 11th of Muharram, as the army of Umar ibn Sa'd went and was gathering together the women and the children and decapitating the bodies of the family members and companions of Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam, they realized that Hassan al-Muthanna was alive, and after they saw his wounds, they let him survive, and he was amongst those who were taken as captive from Karbala to Kufa until the end of the journey. The third group of those who narrated the tragedy of Karbala were the enemy army. Someone says, why should we take what the enemies of Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam have to say? In historiography, we have a principle known as the criterion for embarrassment. If someone openly admits toward committing an atrocity like killing a child, a 6-month-old infant, why would they do something like that if they truly didn't do it? There was something in their heart that allowed for them to expose the truth because they felt embarrassed by it. And because of this reality, we take the testimony and the evidence as presented by the enemy army of Imam al-Husayn alayhi salatu wasalam as a means to also inform that which took place on the day of Ashura. And finally, the fourth group of those who narrated the tragedy of Karbala are of course the infallible Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, Imams Zayn al-Abidin and al-Baqir, peace and blessings be upon them, who were present on the day of Ashura. And we certainly get some detail about the day of Ashura from them and their narrations, peace and blessings be upon them.
فصرف بوجهه عنها ودموعه تسيل على لحيته فقالت ويحكم أما فيكم مسلم فلم يجبها أحد ثم صاح ابن سعد بالناس انزلوا إليه وأريحوه فبدر إليه شمر فرفسه برجله.
If I was to think back at my first time reading the tragedy of Karbala, the maqtal of Imam Husayn alayhi salam, it would be about maybe 18 years ago. I opened the book of Tabari and I began reading the narration. That was maybe one of the first times that I cried and that I had tears in my eyes as I began to read it. And I began to read the details of the torture, the murder, and the terrible things that they did to the pure and beloved family of the Prophet. I began to think to myself, how could such a thing happen? I remember that day like it was yesterday. The women of Karbala have contributed greatly to the narration of the tragedy. Fatima bint al-Husayn, Zaynab al-Kubra, Rubab. For example, we have a narration in Kufa when Rubab saw the head of Imam Husayn alayhi salam, she pounced on it, essentially, put it in her lap, and started crying and narrating a line of poetry, basically saying that I left my beloved on the sand of Karbala, and for the sake of his thirst and his murder, O Allah, do not irrigate this land with water again. It's a very beautiful line. Or for example, when Sayyidah Zaynab is in the court of Ibn Ziyad, one of the first times we read in the maqtal literature that she began to cry. And then she gets into a conversation with Ibn Ziyad as he's cursing Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam. We have many, many narrations and instances like this. Noble women like Fatima bint al-Husayn, Fatima, the daughter of Imam Husayn alayhi salam, narrate to us some of the very gruesome details, right? She narrates, for example, in Tabari it's narrated, and other places it's narrated through her, that they broke the anklets off the legs of the women of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam.
Many people wonder, why would Imam Husayn, peace be upon him, take his family and children on such a dangerous journey? When you're going to a place with a lot of uncertainties, a lot of danger. One reason why Imam Husayn alayhi salam took his family with him to Karbala is for them to serve as the media for the mission of Karbala. Those women and children would tell the world what happened in the land of Karbala. So many of the events that we hear about Karbala, they come from the family of Imam Husayn. His sister Zaynab alayhi salam, his sister Kulthum, peace be upon her. They have narrated some of the events that happened in Karbala, how they were attacked, how those children would be harassed, the night of Ashura, and how the Imam alayhi salam gathered his companions. Lady Zaynab alayhi salam narrates some of these events. The children of Imam Husayn alayhi salam, like Lady Sakina, she has narrated some of these events because she survived after Karbala. She spoke about what happened in Karbala, what happened when Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam was massacred, how they were taken from Karbala to Kufa, from Kufa to Sham, and the very detailed events that would happen. Lady Sakina would narrate a lot of that.
One of the most prominent narrators of the Battle of Karbala is a name we hear often on the pulpits today, Humayd ibn Muslim. He is probably one of the most important narrators when it comes to what happened to Imam Husayn and his family and companions on the day of Ashura. And yet surprisingly, he was not one of the companions of Imam Husayn and did not fight alongside him. So who was he, and where did his allegiance lie?
One of the journalists or reporters who were present in Karbala was Humayd ibn Muslim. We do not know exactly when he arrived Karbala. Some reports indicate he might have arrived on the 9th of Muharram. Even though he does narrate some events that led to the Battle of Karbala, we don't exactly know who commissioned him to go and document the events of Karbala, but he was a friend of Umar ibn Sa'd. We can conclude that his mission was to work for Umar ibn Sa'd. He was there to document the events so he can tell the Amir, meaning Ibn Ziyad, Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad in Kufa, how victorious they were. It seems like this was the intent. He is on the camp of Ibn Ziyad. He was not with Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam. And that's why you don't really find him narrating anything that would happen in the tents of Imam Husayn. Many of the reports that we have about Karbala come from him. For instance, he narrates to us that when Ali al-Akbar was killed, how Imam Husayn alayhi salam walked up to his body And he said, Bunayya Ali, ala dunya ba'daka al-afa. My dear son Ali, what is the value of this world after you? These very heartbreaking moments were narrated by Humayd ibn Muslim. And how Lady Zaynab alayhi salam came running, crying over her nephew, and Imam Husayn alayhi salam sends her back to the tent. And then how Imam Husayn asks members of Bani Hashim to help him take the dismembered body of Ali al-Akbar back to the tents. The very last few minutes of the life of Imam Husayn, how he fell from the horse, how they struck him with rocks, with spears, with arrows, with swords. This is also narrated by Humayd ibn Muslim. He was there till the very last minute, watching what would happen. And then he also witnesses the events after the killing of Imam Husayn alayhi salam. Some reports indicate that when they wanted to kill Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam, he stepped in. He told Shimr ibn al-Jawshan, isn't it enough for you that you've already killed the men? Why do you want to kill him? The Amir is already happy with you. You've won the battle. Because he was moved by the tragedy and by what happened there. Yes, he did go as a reporter working with Umar ibn Sa'd, but when he saw the viciousness of what happened, it seemed that touched him to an extent. He also narrates the incident of the young daughter of Imam Husayn alayhi salam, which he calls Fatima Sughra, and part of her garment had caught on fire. And she was walking on the hot plains of Karbala barefoot. He says, I felt bad for her. I helped her put out the fire. And then she stood under my horse just to be shaded from the scorching hot sun. He says, she was extremely thirsty. I could tell that she was about to perish from thirst. So I took her to the river and I wanted to give her some water. He says, before she drank the water, she asked me a question. She told me, I have a question. The last time I saw my father before he farewelled us, his lips had withered. He was very thirsty. Before you guys killed him, did you give him some water? Humayd ibn Muslim says, I told her, unfortunately, we did not. He says, at that point, she refused to take the water. She spilled the water. I'm not going to drink when my father died thirsty. And then she tells him, take me to Ghari, dullani ala al-Ghari. Which way is Najaf? Ghari is another word for Najaf. I told her, young girl, yet Najaf is far from here. What do you have in Najaf? She says, I want to complain to our grandfather Ali ibn Abi Talib for what happened to us here. And then she faced Najaf and she spoke to her grandfather, Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam.
More likely than not, Humayd ibn Muslim was one of the members of the army of Umar ibn Sa'd, who worked under the battalion or under the authority of Shimr ibn al-Jawshan. Likely Humayd ibn Muslim was someone who sought to replenish his own image in history by talking about the fact that he was not with Imam al-Husayn, nor was he against him. When again, all evidence suggests that he was a man who supported the army of Umar ibn Sa'd, at least on the day of Ashura.
It seems after the tragedy of Karbala, Humayd ibn Muslim was regretful. Why did I not defend Abi Abdullah al-Husayn? So he later joins the Tawabin, the Repenters revolution. The Repenters, basically, they gathered shortly after Karbala, within the following years, and they wanted God to forgive them for not doing more to support Imam Husayn alayhi salam. So they went to the grave of Imam Husayn. They would cry day and night. And then they decided to fight the Umayyads until death. Initially, Humayd ibn Muslim did join them. But later, when the fighting became serious, he left.
Growing up, the first time we heard about the maqtal of Imam Husayn alayhi salam was the first year we joined Ahlul Bayt school in Ghana. And prior to that, we never heard anything about how did Imam Husayn got killed. None of this information was ever shared with us. Personally, first time, I was at shock of what I heard. Then it kept going in my mind that, is it real that somebody will really do such thing like that? I couldn't believe it myself. And I can remember in Masjid al-Rasul al-Akram, where teacher was crying, and many of us were crying. That was the first time I could see many people in the masjid crying.
As is typical with the way history reaches us, there are some variations and some details that can be found when comparing the various maqatil of Imam Husayn. Perhaps one of the most prominent disparities is the name of the killer of Imam Husayn. While the most popularized narrations tell us that the one who killed Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam was Shimr ibn al-Jawshan, some reports suggest it was a man named Sinan ibn Anas. So who really killed Imam Husayn?
Whatever the case is, from the Shia school of thought, from the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, it is proven and it is being confirmed that the one who killed Imam Husayn was Shimr. That is exactly what we have. And that's what the majority of the narration says. You can see that even in Ziyarat Ashura, specifically Shimr is mentioned in there. وَلَعْنَ اللَّهُ Shimra. That is one. And number two, when you come to the narration of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, it is mentioned that the final moment of Imam Husayn alayhi salam, Shimr was the one who was there. He was the one who spoke to Imam Husayn alayhi salam. And Imam Husayn asked him, Ya Shimr ata'arifuni, do you know me? And he mentioned my name, Ya Shimr ata'arifuni. Then he said, Bala a'arifuka haqqa al-ma'arifa. I know you very well. Then Imam Husayn asked him, who am I? He says, Anta al-Husayn wa abuka Ali wa ummuka al-Zahra wa jadduka Rasulullah. Which is the best definition you can ever ask for about Imam Husayn. The narration goes into details what he did, and finally he was the one who cut the head of Imam Husayn alayhi salam on the day of Ashura. So from the side of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, the actually killer of Imam Husayn was Shimr ibn al-Jawshan. So Sinan is never majority from the narration of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam in that sense. And it could be from some of the narration, it's just to drive some of the fact away from the root of what exactly happened. And also, we have many books, like for example, if you go to the book called Jaza'u Qatalat al-Husayn, the reward of those who killed Imam Husayn alayhi salam, it talks about each one of those companions and the role they played. Who did what? Who didn't do what? Who were those who were on the water preventing Imam Husayn alayhi salam? Who actually killed who among the entire companion? They all documented, and the documentation also proved that the killer of Imam Husayn is Shimr ibn al-Jawshan.
السلام على آدم صفوة الله من خليقته السلام على شيخ ولي الله وخيرته السلام على إدريس القائم لله بحجته.
Another important source that tells us not only various details of what happened that day in Karbala, but also the names of various companions and family members of Imam Husayn is Ziyarat al-Nahiya. It is a salutation to Imam Husayn that is an integral part of Shi'i heritage and is recited all across the world. Though it is attributed to the 12th Shi'i Imam, Imam al-Mahdi Ajjalallahu Ta'ala Faraja, some question its authenticity. So is it something that we can rely on?
Ziyarat al-Nahiya al-Muqaddasa is a salutation that's been attributed to the 12th Imam Sahib al-Amr, Ajjalallahu Ta'ala Faraja. And we have two different versions within our historical records. One is Ziyarat al-Nahiya, which is a salutation upon each and every one of the companions of Imam al-Husayn alayhi salatu wasalam. Thus we have their names as narrated by Imam Mahdi. The second, the more popular version of Ziyarat al-Nahiya al-Muqaddasa is the ziyarah of Imam al-Zaman to Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam, which tells us and gives us a great detail about that which took place and transpired on the day of Ashura. And it is one of the most important early sources that we have of the maqtal of Imam Husayn alayhi salatu wasalam. Many would argue that Ziyarat Nahiya al-Muqaddasa cannot be accurately attributed to Imam al-Zaman. This particular ziyarah is narrated in a work by the name of Mazar al-Kabir, by a scholar by the name of Sheikh Muhammad ibn Ja'far al-Mashhadi, who compiles many different supplications and adhkar and ziyarat of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, and amongst them Ziyarat Nahiya al-Muqaddasa, which again speaks to so many details of that which took place on the day of Ashura. The biggest question mark around this particular ziyarah is with regards to its sanad, or its chain of transmission. And most would reject Ziyarat Nahiya al-Muqaddasa because it doesn't have an accurate chain of transmission that goes back to the Imam of our time. In the beginning, or the introduction to the work, Sheikh Muhammad al-Mashhadi, he narrates that he removed and truncated all of the asanid of the adhkar and of the dua and of the ziyarat that he presents within his text, with the sole purpose of making it more accessible to the reader. He, a scholar of great distinction, known for his expertise in ahadith and in ziyarat and in adhkar, he says that everything that I'm presenting to you is of sound value. Now, even if we were critical of him, at the very least, we give him the benefit of the doubt to suggest that that which is presented in Ziyarat Nahiya al-Muqaddasa has some truth to it, even if every single word may not be attributed to Imam al-Zaman. This is number one. Secondly, many of our classical scholars, including those who are known to be very strict in their approaches toward ahadith and taking a look at the asanid, they themselves would oft recite Ziyarat Nahiya al-Muqaddasa of Imam al-Zaman in their visitations to Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam, including the renowned marja of his time, Sheikh Ja'far Kashif al-Ghita, who was known to consistently recite Ziyarat Nahiya al-Muqaddasa, who passes away about 50 or 70 years ago.
Looking at the ziyarah itself, it is beautiful from a linguistic aspect. It's like a form of magnificent rhyming prose. It begins by describing the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then going on to describing the attributes of Imam al-Husayn, for example, Rabi'ul Aytam, that he was the spring for orphans. Describing the various attributes of who Imam al-Husayn was, his character, that essentially to kill Imam al-Husayn is like someone is trying to kill La ilaha illallah, or eliminate La ilaha illallah. That basically Imam al-Husayn, everything that he stood for represents La ilaha illallah. And then also describing the details of his death. For example, it states, and they showered him with spears. They blocked him off from the Furat. Shimr sat on his chest with a dagger to his neck, as the sweat of death dripped or came down his face. He looked right and left with his hands opening and closing, looking towards his family before he died. So describing in great detail the final moments of Imam Husayn alayhi salam. It's very moving, it's very powerful. And if we can rely on the narration of Ibn al-Mashhadi in his Mazar al-Kabir, then we can reasonably believe that it is possible that the 12th Imam, may Allah hasten his reappearance, narrated to us the siyarah.
After the Battle of Karbala, many of the killers of Imam Husayn were killed directly or by the order of Mukhtar al-Thaqafi. Many of them would admit their crimes and actions of what they did in Karbala before their deaths, giving us further clarity to what happened on the day of Ashura. Who was Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, and what role did he play in avenging the death of Imam Husayn?
Al-Mukhtar al-Thaqafi is a very important figure after the Battle of Karbala. He wanted to join Imam Husayn alayhi salam, but he was imprisoned in Kufa. Ibn Ziyad had him lashed 100 times, and also he imprisoned him in Kufa, so he could not go to Karbala and help Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam. Later he went to Iraq, he established the seat of his government in Kufa, and he led an uprising against the Umayyads. And his main mission was to seek revenge from all the killers of Imam Husayn alayhi salam. So he would tell his men, go and find where they are, where they're hiding. Bring me reports, eyewitnesses, anything you can find. Who did what? in Karbala, they have to be punished. Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, he was killed by the son of Malik al-Ashtar, but he was working with al-Mukhtar. Umar ibn Sa'd, Shimr ibn Dhil Jawshan, they were all killed by the direct command of al-Mukhtar. So he killed many, tens if not hundreds of those evil people who were present in Karbala, and they contributed in killing al-Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam. But one of them was Harmala. One narrator states, I met al-Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam in Hijaz, and he asked me, where is Harmala in Kufa? Is he alive? He responds to the Imam, yes, when I left Kufa, he was still alive. The Imam alayhi salam raised his hand in dua and he said, Oh Allah, make him taste the pain of iron and the pain of fire. Harmala really broke the hearts of the Ahlul Bayt. The venomous arrows, the three-pronged arrows that he would shoot at the members of Ahlul Bayt is something that the Ahlul Bayt were traumatized over. He is the one who shot al-Imam al-Husayn in his chest, such that his arrow went to the heart of Abu Abdullah al-Husayn. You have an evil man who struck the heart of the grandson of Rasulullah. Is there a tragedy greater than that? He also slaughtered the infant carried in the arms of Imam Husayn alayhi salam, from vein to vein, min al-warid ila al-warid. Some reports also state that he shot Abu al-Fadl Abbas alayhi salam in his eyes, or the son of Imam al-Hasan who came to protect his father, his uncle in those final moments. He shot him and he killed him in front of his uncle. So this narrator, he goes back to Kufa, he meets al-Mukhtar. During that time, al-Mukhtar had just captured Harmala. So they bring him to al-Mukhtar. Al-Mukhtar has his hands amputated, his legs cut and amputated, and then he is burnt to die. This narrator, when he saw that, he said, Subhanallah. He told him, I just came back from meeting al-Imam Ali ibn al-Husayn Zayn al-Abidin, and he made this dua on against Harmala. At that point, al-Mukhtar came down from his horse and he prostrated to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Undoubtedly, the greatest source of the details of what happened on the day of Ashura is the fourth Imam himself and the surviving son of Imam al-Husayn, Imam Ali Zayn al-Abidin. Throughout the remainder of his life, he never let people forget what happened to his father and the atrocities of the day of Ashura.
Imam Zayn al-Abidin, salamullahi alayhi, had played a very, very important role. Him being the Imam after Imam Husayn alayhi salam, aftermath of Karbala, Imam Zayn al-Abidin was not allowed to speak. When they were taken as a prisoner in the castle of Yazid, he has to ask permission to even speak in that crowd. They wouldn't allow him. And even when they gave him, they wouldn't let him to speak his mind to the end. They have to interrupt with adhan to cut him off. Even though with all of this restriction, the first thing Imam Zayn al-Abidin did was to adapt a new system through dua, which he used as a way to educate people and reach to people. And that's why we have today what we call a Sahifa Sajjadiyya from Imam Zayn al-Abidin. Imam Zayn al-Abidin used to go to the market and buy slaves in the market and then bring them home and keep them with him for the entire year. Now the entire year what he does is to give them the crash course about Islam. Quran, ahadith, fiqh, history, all of that he will give them. It is mentioned that on the day of Arafah, Imam Zayn al-Abidin will tell all of them, you are no longer slaves. From today, you are all free. One condition is you have to tell the people wherever you are about what happened to my father. That was the condition of Imam Zayn al-Abidin. And that is one of the ways that people were able to hear about the tragedy of Karbala. You will be surprised that historically, even in Africa, that's how people were able to get the story of Karbala.
Perhaps the most well-known Shia narration in our text, that is in the Kutub al-Hadith of Shia, is the maqtal of Imam Husayn as narrated by Imam Zayn al-Abidin in the Amali of Sheikh al-Saduq and in other texts as well. In this narration, Imam Zayn al-Abidin describes the events of the day of Karbala. It's a very interesting and important narration. I believe this narration and description of the events of Karbala should be necessary reading.
Every time he'd drink water, he would mix the water with his tears. Every time he would eat food, he would remember the hunger of Imam Husayn alayhi salam. Every time he'd pass by, he would see a sheep being slaughtered. He would look towards Karbala and he would say, my father Husayn, in this ummah, even the sheep is given water before it's slaughtered, but you were slaughtered without water. It is these moments that kept the legacy of Imam Husayn alive. In times of severe persecution, when the Umayyads had a firm grip on power still, Imam al-Husayn, through his tears, he mobilized the nation to wake up and know what happened to Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam. One of his companions, he says, once I heard al-Imam Ali ibn al-Husayn alayhi salam go into sujood and he would cry excessively. After decades, I told him, Ama ana lihuznika an yanqadi. Isn't it time for your sorrow to end? Come on, it's 30, 35 years. He told me, woe upon you. Yaqub, Jacob, he was a prophet of Allah, and God gave him 12 sons. He was separated from one of them. And he was not killed. He was in this world. He was just separated from Yusuf. But he cried until his eyes became white. He cried until his back became bent. And I saw 17 members from my family, along with my father, Imam Husayn, massacred around me. You really expect my sorrow to end? So that flame of Karbala, the immense grief, was kept alive by al-Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam. Al-Imam Zayn al-Abidin did not have an army, did not have a state, but he had the power of the tear. Through the power of the tear, he kept the memory of Karbala alive. And today, we would not know Karbala the way we know it without al-Imam Zayn al-Abidin. Without him keeping that passion. Every passion that you and I have today, it is from al-Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam. He was instrumental in that.
It has been over a millennium that the story of Karbala lives on as a legacy through the commemoration of Ashura. A continuous revival of the tale of the stand of one man against a tyrant has sparked revolutions in the hearts and souls of believers all across the world, and is a revival that will continue for the millennia to come, reminding the people of the defiant stand of Husayn ibn Ali.